Raina, Book 4, Part 9. Phil turned, taking my hand. "You are gonna pay for this," he hissed towards the bushes. Someone stepped out from behind the brush, and I gasped. Everything happened so fast then. They seemed to come from everywhere. Phil backed up against me, and then something hit me in the back of the head. Just as the world went dark, I saw Phil falling, and my mind screamed out to him. When I finally came to, I put my hand to the back of my head and winced. Everything was blurry, and I couldn't seem to clear it even when I shook myself hard. I blinked several times, smelling my own dried blood. Why couldn't I focus? My mind seemed only slightly fuzzy, but my eyes couldn't lock on anything specific. It was as if the world had been smeared by some giant hand. I closed them tightly and drew in a long breath. I could smell concrete and metal. I tilted my head again and inhaled slower, then gasped, "Silver." When I opened my eyes, things started to clear a bit more, and I slapped a hand over my mouth, turning around in a small circle. I was in a small room with cement walls. There was a small bed near one wall and a table with a bowl and a cloth next to it. But I ran towards the door and went to reach for the handle. The scent stopped me cold. I leaned forward a bit, sniffing the door. The smell of silver made me flinch and take a step back. My heart raced, and I took another step away from it. Silver, pure silver, would kill a werewolf. Since I was only part wolf, it meant it could still kill me. That door couldn't be made of pure silver, or it wouldn't be able to stand. But it was metal and seemed... I inhaled again, from the safer distance, to either be coated in or flecked with enough pure silver to make it a wall I couldn't touch, let alone open. It might as well have stood unlocked. If my skin came into direct contact with that, it would soak into my pores, and if enough got in me, it could kill me. I turned, ran over to the bed, and yanked the blanket off. Wrapping it around my hand, I moved back to the door and winced as I tried the handle. It was locked. I yanked it hard, but even my vampire strength wouldn't budge it. I growled and threw the blanket on the floor as if it would bite me. "Who are you?" I yelled, lifting my head up. When no one replied, I clenched my fist. "My dad will destroy you for this." Again, only silence. Growling, I turned and headed towards one of the walls. Cement or not, I could smash through it, or at least try. I brought my fist up and then stopped, seeing the shiny flecks in the paint that coated it. Suddenly, I brought my hands in and wrapped them around me. Inhaling the aroma wouldn't kill me, but if flecks got in the air... I shook my head, trying to comprehend what was happening. A thought hit me hard, and I looked at the floor under my bare feet. Thankfully, it was dark gray and fleck-free. "Hello?" I tried, and again got nothing. I started to panic and walked the small room, trying to find a way out. It was only about 12 feet long and maybe twice as wide, so it didn't take long to scout the perimeter. I did it a dozen times, searching from a safe distance. There was nothing. Then I heard a scraping sound and whipped around to see a small slot in the door slide open. It was eye level, but even peering, I couldn't see anyone. "We do not wish to harm you," came a male's voice. It was low, and he was older, my father's age. I inhaled, locking onto his vampire smell. "Let me out," I growled, lowering my chin but keeping my eyes forward. "In time," the male stated, in a voice that shook just a little, although it sounded excited instead of afraid. "Let me out now," I screamed, unable to stay in control. "Once you give us what we want," came another voice, and I balked. It was a female's voice, and this one I did recognize. "Miss Mullender?" I whispered in utter shock. "The name is Ellen," she chuckled from the other side. "As if you would have ever thought to even ask," she huffed at the end, and the first voice mumbled something that silenced her. "What do you want?" I yelled, panic crawling through me. What was she doing here? What was I doing here? "Your secrets, little one," came a chuckling voice. I shook my head and threw my hands out. "I don't have any secrets." I looked around. If this is about my dad, he never tells me anything about his business. My heart was pounding wildly and my stomach had squeezed so tightly I felt nauseous. "Oh, but you've brought your secrets with you," the older man whispered with a chuckle. I frowned and looked down at myself and then gasped. My blood. I remembered my dad sitting on the couch telling me about what pulsed through my veins. I blinked hard and swallowed against my drying throat. "Don't worry, we have no intention of killing such an amazing specimen." I stepped back until the back of my legs hit the frame of the bed, and then I plopped down on it, wrapping my arms around myself. "Please," I whimpered, "please just let me go." "I'm afraid that is not going to be possible," the invisible man stated, taking on an almost fatherly voice. "You see, we have stolen samples of your blood before, and, well, the structure falls apart so quickly. So we needed to bring you to us, so we wouldn't have the delay between taking the samples and studying them." I shook my head, my eyes watering. Then I lifted my arm. "Here, take what you need, and then please, please just let me go." The fear welled up inside of me, and my whole body started to shake. I closed my eyes and called to Phil and Track, begging them to come and get me. "They won't be able to find you here," Miss Mullender chuckled. "The walls are 5 feet thick and coated in pure silver flecks. No wolf could scent you through it, and no vampire's nose could hunt you even without the metal." Her tone was harsh and filled with anger. "Rest for now, and we will talk later," the man said. The slot started to close, and I jumped and ran towards it. "No!" I screamed. "Please, no!" It snapped shut, and I slid to a halt, a foot away from the deadly metal. Tears ran down my face as I stared at the large rectangle that stood between me and freedom. A door I couldn't open, surrounded by walls I couldn't touch. I moved back to the bed and sat on the edge. I touched my chest and then gasped and looked down, patting under the neck of my dress. The necklace was gone. My eyes searched the floor, and I turned and ripped off all the covers, shaking them out. "No, no," I hissed through my tears. "You can stop looking for it." I froze and turned slowly, hearing her voice through the slit. "Even though I ordered it, we couldn't take any chance they slipped a tracking device into it." "How could you do this?" I hissed, wiping the tears away roughly. "You work for my father." She huffed from the other side. "I slaved for that man for decades," she spat, "working my way up as high as I could, gaining his confidence. For this?" She actually laughed then. "Not at first. I actually had other goals in mind." I winced. But when Thomas never showed any signs of interest, I decided it was time to find other ways to advance. She was quiet for a long moment, and I kept my eyes on the opening. When your little condition leaked out, vampires swarmed from all over. Some wanted to rally with your father, but others just wanted a piece of the action. I winced and pulled my arms tighter around me. I was approached by dozens of them. So were a lot of other employees. She spat the last word like it burned her throat. But I knew things most of the others didn't. So when your father needed a place to hide, I gently suggested Oliver's. But why? Power, my dear, she chuckled. And right now, you are my ticket to more than I could have gotten by unioning with your father. My stomach turned and my lips twitched. I lowered my head and my hackles tried to rise. Then I frowned when they wouldn't. It's the silver, she whispered in a voice that froze my blood. It weakens you without harming you. Unless you touched it. She laughed. Then the little windows slid closed. Back at Oliver's mansion, the chaos was mind-boggling. Track had heard Raina call out in her mind and had convinced Michael to open the door to the pool. When they all rushed in, they found Phil, unconscious, with some sort of rock laying next to his head. Silver, Track gasped, grabbing his friend's feet and pulling him away from the rock. They knocked him out and left that there so he wouldn't come to. He knelt down as the room filled with guards. Come on, man. Wake up, Track growled, tapping his friend's face. Rock knelt down and Jackson ran over, Ryan close behind him. Phil moaned and they all squatted as he came to. When he blinked and looked up at them, his eyes widened. He sprang to his feet and then teetered. Ryan jumped up and grabbed his shoulders to steady him. Easy now. Raina, Phil yelled and then spun around. Where is she? Ryan shook his head and Phil shoved his outfit out of the way and ran towards a set of guards. Michael spun on him hard and Phil ignored it. Where is she? That's what I'm trying to find out, the man nearly screamed. Phil looked back. There were about 6 of them. He stated, and two more guards trotted over to listen. They were all bats. Vampires, Phil continued. It happened so fast. He swallowed hard as fear mixed with his anger. I should have never done this. Done what? They all turned to see Thomas. His face was hard and his eyes tight. Had her come here without the guards. Thomas's lip twitched and he looked at Michael. What do we know? Michael turned to Phil, who retold what little he did know. 6 men had jumped them, hitting him on the head. It all happened in a matter of seconds, he hissed. They must have been hiding in here. He looked around, then turned to Michael. How did they get her out? We don't know yet. Over here, someone yelled, and they all ran towards the voice. A group of men stood around the back of the waterfall. Part of the rock was open, showing a doorway and a passage. It's for the maintenance crew, one guard stated, and Michael nodded and turned. You 3 stay here, by this door. You 2 take half the room. You 2 the other half. He shouted a few more orders to the guards, then stepped into the rock. The werewolves, Thomas, and 2 other guards followed. Is she wearing any tracking devices? Track asked as they wound around a corner lined in plain white walls with dim lights. No, Thomas growled, and Track returned the gesture. Ryan shook his head. We don't need them. Phil can find her. Ryan shook his head again. Phil stopped short and Jackson had to pull up fast to keep from slamming into him. He nodded and closed his eyes, trying to force his rage aside enough to focus. He thought about her face, and he felt his heart catch. Focus, he hissed to himself. Then he felt it, that amazing pull that had led him to her from miles away. His eyes shot open, he pushed through the others and followed it. He was running down hallways now, through the pool maintenance area filled with stacked chemicals, baby plants, and walls of other things used to keep the tropical paradise alive. He flung open a door and rushed through it into another passageway. "He's got her!" Track yelled over his shoulder as he rushed to keep up. Phil's mind had to fight to stay clear. His emotions were threatening to fog his body and mind with the rage that was building. They had taken her, with him standing right there, and they were going to pay. He turned again, the sensation growing stronger as he went. He knew where she was, not by sight, but by direction. When he turned and ran down another path, he was almost smiling. She was close. They hadn't even gotten her out of the mansion yet. That was a very good sign. Then he shoved open another door and then ran into a large room. He stopped short and frowned. "This is the track?" Jackson stated, confused, as they all stepped out of the maintenance tunnel and looked around. Phil closed his eyes again, feeling the pull, letting it talk to him. "She's here," he stated, opening his eyes. "I can feel her." "Search it," Michael snapped, and at the guards that had come with them. "Rip everything apart if you have to." "They are stuck in the mansion," Thomas snapped, his eyes everywhere. "They're hiding and trying to find a way out." "Good for us," Ryan growled. "Bad for them." The tension was thick as they fanned out, searching the massive track that was pocked with little rooms, booths, and closets. Phil moved closer, listening to that thing inside of him that connected them. He took a step one way, then moved another. Like a beacon, it would get stronger or fade with each movement. Finally, he stopped. "I don't understand," he hissed with clenched fist. "It's telling me she is right here." Track stepped up next to him and sighed. "It's her cart." Phil blinked and turned, seeing the green cart with the painted wings on the side. "No," Phil yelled. "It's not a scent. I'm not following her scent. It's everywhere here." He turned and looked at Track. "It wasn't her scent that told me how to find her hours away in the city." Track frowned and nodded. "But she isn't here, Phil. Maybe the silver—" "No," Phil roared, spinning around. "She is here, right here, somehow." His voice trailed off as he tried to make sense of it. Thomas and the wolves walked over. "How's that possible?" "She isn't here, Phil." They all thought that Track's theory made sense. "The silver probably has effects," Brian tried. "They didn't hit you with the rock, or you'd still be down," he stated, his eyes still scanning the area where they stood. "But you were exposed, and pure silver weakens us, body and mind." "No," Phil whispered through clenched teeth. "Aote isn't affected by silver, or by anything," he shouted. "There is no Aote," Thomas yelled, and they all looked at him. The veins in his neck popped and his face was hard. "Someone tampered with her DNA. They put another type of DNA in her." He looked ready to rip Phil to shreds when he glared at him. "It's witch DNA, and it's affecting her wolf genes." Phil's eyes shot open, and Track let out a string of cuss words. But Phil shook his head. "Doesn't matter. This is different." Then he turned and moved slowly, taking only one step and then back again. "You may love my daughter," the vampire spat, "but there is no wolf legend pulling you to her." Phil smiled and then looked down. "I disagree." Then he pointed to the asphalt under his feet. When the others just stared at him, he looked over them all to Michael. "She's under here." Everyone looked down at his feet, and then one of the guards hollered out to him. Michael ran over, then called out. When they reached him, they found a doorway with stairs that led down. Phil nodded, and they crammed down the dark stairwell. At the bottom, Phil again pushed through them all and trotted down another narrow maintenance tunnel. A few workers had to stop and flatten themselves against the wall as they rushed past. Phil heard them be questioned, but he didn't slow. He could feel her, and his heart beat madly. She was afraid, and he clenched his teeth, trying not to think about what he was going to do with whoever took her. He had to concentrate. He finally stopped in front of a wall and frowned. The others spread out and reported dead ends as well. "No," Phil hissed again, staring at the concrete wall. "I know she's here." Michael's phone rang and he tapped his ear. "They caught a group of workers trying to escape," he reported. They all turned as he listened. Finally, he shook his head. They were just running scared. Phil turned back to the wall. "She's on the other side of this." Thomas pulled something out of his pocket and started tapping buttons. "This will get us the blueprints of the entire place." He held it up so Michael could look, and they both shook their head. "It's a foundation wall," Raina's dad stated. "There's nothing on the other side." "There is." "Look," Thomas roared. "There is no magical pull, no matter what happened before. I told you that. You're wasting your time. They're getting away with my daughter, and you have us staring at a wall and chasing fairy tales." He turned, nodded to Michael, and they started to run back down the hall. Ryan sighed, and Phil shook his head. "She is right here. You have to trust me." Track nodded. "Okay. But how would they get her through a solid cement wall?" They all moved up to it, sniffing and running their hands over the cold surface, looking for a seam or something that would indicate a way through. "There's nothing here," Ryan hissed. Phil turned to Track, his eyes wide with desperation. "You're her best friend. You are all bonded to us through Aote," he stated, ignoring Ryan's hard look. He was desperate and had to make them believe. Every part of him knew she was right there. No DNA experiment could do that. If they did something to her, how could it affect us? Jackson nodded. "He's right." Ryan frowned. "It's solid concrete, Phil." "With Raina on the other side," Phil shot out. He turned and started to look around. "Find something. Anything. We have to break through." Rock, Jackson, and Track started searching the area for tools. Ryan shook his head. "The silver has thrown off your tracking. The pull. It has thrown the pull off." When Phil shook his head, Ryan took his shoulders and turned to him. "Listen to me. I have seen it work. I was there when you tracked her down in the city. Unlike Thomas, I believe. I believe in Aote, and I believe in the power between the two of you." Phil frowned, his eyes watering. Ryan sighed. "But it's a wall, Phil." "Since when have they built a wall that could keep a wolf out?" Jackson stated, giving a hard smile and bouncing a large hammer in one hand. "I'm not going to lose her," Phil hissed in a low whisper. Ryan shook his head. "I will order you." "No," Track stated quickly, running up with something large in his hand. "Ryan, man, don't." He stood in front of their alpha, handing the massive piece of equipment to Rock. "We are Pack. We have seen and felt this. You know it's real. The silver didn't touch him. We have to believe he's right. What if you order us to leave and she really is right here?" "What are they doing to her?" Rock growled deeply then, and a tear fell from Track's tight eyes. We have to believe in it, or all of this is just a good story. Ryan looked at Track and then gave a small nod. Rock lifted the jackhammer, put it against the wall, and hit the button. I jumped when I heard a noise, but turned away from the door looking at the wall. I frowned and peered at it, trying to make it out. It sounded like a hum, but was far enough away that my ears couldn't get a good fix on it. Then I gasped as the door opened. I lunged and rushed forward without thinking. The man that walked in yelped, dropping whatever was in his hand. I knocked him down quickly and scrambled up to get out the opening. I saw her there and reached for her, pulling her in and under me, so I was half on top of both of them. She shouted and struggled, but I didn't care. My eyes were forward, on the hallway. Suddenly, it felt as if all the strength in my body was drained. It was like trying to run through thick mud. I had to struggle to move and force my head up while I was still crawling over my father's assistant. Ellen shoved me hard, sending me flying back into the room. She jumped up, slapping her hair out of her face, and stormed over to me. I growled, my head lowered as I felt my muscles start to come around. Then she knelt down, grinned, and held up a large round disc. I moaned as the energy left me. "Silver," she nearly cooed with a smirk on her face. "Quite the design, too. See how it's scooped, like a satellite dish," she explained, gesturing at the object with the other hand. I growled and tried to swing at her, but she leaned back and easily avoided my flopping arm. "It reflects and projects the effects forward," she winked, "rendering you, or any wolf, nearly helpless." She wrinkled her nose. "But don't worry. The effects aren't permanent. We have to keep that precious blood of yours as healthy as possible." Then she looked down. "Which is why Dr. Moran is here." The man carefully climbed out, and I glared at her as I dragged myself into a sitting position. I took another swing, but I might as well have been dancing and waving my arms in slow motion. "Now, be a good little freak and let the doctor draw some of that blood, okay?" I hissed, and she wiggled her brows while the man quickly gathered his things and knelt next to me. My head flopped a bit when I turned. "They will kill you," I hissed at him. He flinched, but quickly pulled out a syringe. "I wonder what would happen if I touched you with this," she whispered, her voice tight and filled with the power she felt she had over me. My head flopped the other way, and she wiggled the disc in front of my face. My head spun, and my tongue seemed to swell a bit in my mouth. My anger roared through my body and mind, but my body was limp and refused to respond. I felt the needle go in and tried to flex my muscle to snap it. He got his blood before my body can complete the thought. "Delicious," she whispered, eyeing it. I tried to kick my foot out and fell backwards, moaning as my head slammed against the hard floor. "Make sure she didn't crack that skull of hers," the woman chuckled as she stood, still holding the shield in front of her. I lowered my eyes as a man sat me up, piercing her with my look. She blinked and nodded to the doctor, who grabbed up his things and rushed out past her. "Now, why don't you go take a little nap?" With that, she turned and left, shutting the door slowly behind her. Within seconds, I was able to jump up, shivering with anger. I screamed at the door, telling her what I was going to do when I got out. I threatened everyone on the other side until my throat hurt. I wanted to rush the door and deal with silver poisoning later, but I knew better. If my skin made contact with pure silver, it would absorb it like water to a sponge. There would be no time to save me. Chapter 14. On the other side of the wall, Rock's body shook as he pushed the jackhammer into the concrete. There is no way they had time to build a complete wall, Ryan snapped, and Phil flinched. Track shook his head. Then there's another way over there, but we can't seem to find it, so this is our best option right now. Ryan frowned. The urge to order them was strong. This didn't make any sense. But the fear that they wouldn't obey chilled him. Pack wolves had to obey their alpha, at least when a very direct order was given. Could Aote really be stronger? He turned and looked down the hall, replaying the information Thomas had shouted out at the track. Someone had tampered with Reina's DNA, somehow adding witch genes to her makeup. How was that even possible? What did it even mean? Who did it and why? Dozens of questions swarmed in his mind to mix with the panic. Did the same person or people take her? Rock swore and they all turned as he threw down the smoking tool. "It's too small," he growled. Phil walked up, putting his hand against the wall. "Tay, if you can hear me or sense me, we are right here. We will find you," he whispered. Ryan stepped up next to him. "We need to find another way over there," he stated, and Phil nodded. Don't be afraid, he thought, feeling the pull inside him pulse. "We are coming for you." With that, they all turned and started to slowly scout back down the hall, looking for any hidden doors that could lead them around the wall. Somewhere else? Ellen shook her head at the doctor. "You are worthless," she hissed, standing next to him at a small lab table. Now, dear," the older man said, stepping up to her. "You're making him as nervous as a human in a trap." He chuckled at his own joke, and then slipped his arm around her young waist. She flinched, but let him pull her back a few steps. "My beautiful accomplice," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her neck and looking at her too long. "Remember our deal." When she didn't reply right away, he leaned forward. "You are mine, or you are dead. There is no other option, my dear." Her mouth twitched into a smile, and he relaxed his grip. "Now, let the poor doctor work. I have people waiting for answers, and he clearly can't get them with you hissing threats in his ear." "Oliver," she sighed, trying to calm her own fear. This was a very powerful man, and one with very little compassion when he wanted something. "They know that we need to test this." The owner of the mansion leaned forward, brushing his lips against her skin. "They will wait as long as I tell them to," he whispered. "This place is crawling with her people and the wolves," she replied in a shaky voice. His touch made her ill, but she was just as trapped as Thomas's precious little daughter. When he kissed her skin, she closed her eyes and tried to think of other things. She had worked so many years and had never gotten the recognition or power she knew she deserved. If it meant draping herself over this man's arms, then she would find a way to do it. "No one will ever find this place," he moaned, wrapping his other hand behind her neck as he continued to nuzzle his trophy. "I had it built hundreds of years ago, when wolves were less complacent than they are now." He chuckled again. "There is only one way in or out, and they will never find the hidden passage." Then he tightened his grip on her neck and smiled when she gasped. He loved powers. Always had. Thomas had succumbed to keeping his through politics. He had secretly attained his through less time-consuming ways. Soon he would have the greatest power there is, the ability to walk in the sun. Even if the little hybrid proved unable, her blood was like mounds of gold. The list of those that would pay him anything he demanded was long and would only grow. Thomas may control the world of vampires that they walked in, but he controlled the hidden parts that were growing every day. Ellen whimpered, and he relaxed his grip, ignoring the red marks he left. On the other side, Phil and the others knocked down locked doors, ripped apart closets, and threatened workers as they moved back down the passages. When they ended up back at the stairwell, Rock threw his hands up. "Nothing," he growled. Phil looked back at the hallway, still feeling her on the other end. "Count the paces," he stated, and Track frowned, but then his eyes widened. He moved to the stairs and walked quickly down the hall, counting out as he went. 19, he replied as he jogged back. They all rushed back up the stairs to go to the cart track. "It's about here," Ryan stated, pointing to where the bottom of the stairs would be under them. Track stood in the spot and walked forward again, counting. They walked with him. Rock and Jackson threw things out of his path. 19, Track sighed. As soon as he stood in the spot Phil had stopped on when they first came in. Ryan rubbed his hands through his hair. Rock walked over, shaking a can, then bent over and sprayed a large yellow circle on the asphalt. "Ground zero," he explained as he stood up. They all looked at it and then looked around the track. "There has to be another way down there," Jackson whispered. His forehead wrinkled in frustration. Again they spread out and scanned the go-kart track. They tossed carts like they were made of paper and ripped benches out of the ground. "We're stupid," Track stated, and then gave a hard laugh. He nodded when the others turned. "Okay, so we know where she is. But how they got her here, there," he shook his head, "was through the pool room. That's where they snatched her. There has to be a way here, and it has to come from there." Ryan smiled, and they all turned and ran out of the half-demolished arena. As they flew around one corner, Rock slammed into someone, knocking them to the ground. The wolf jumped up and then frowned, pulling the other up. "Sorry, Miss Mullender, we just..." She shook her head and pushed her hair out of her face. "It's okay." She looked at them and frowned. "Mr. Beldrin sent me to find you. They think they found something," she added, then turned and hurried back the way she had come. Jackson went to take a step forward, and Phil grabbed his arm. She turned a few steps away and nodded. "Hurry, he's waiting." Ryan walked up to her slowly and inhaled. "Care to tell me why Raina's scent is all over you?" he hissed. The guys quickly surrounded her, and she frowned. "I've been helping to search for her. We tore her room apart. I'm sure that..." The alpha shook his head. "That's not how it works. You don't seem to know a lot about werewolves." She huffed and looked around, seeing the 4 hard faces watching her carefully. "Look, I don't know why or how, but Mr. Beldrin is right here." They all turned, and she moaned, slipping one hand into a pocket of her slacks. "Miss Mullender said you told her to come find us." Thomas's brows rose, and he looked at his employee. "Really?" Michael and his 2 guards whirled around just as a dozen other men raced towards them. Jackson saw the woman try to slither away as they attacked, and he reached out and snatched her arm. "No, you don't," he growled as she flinched, pulled her hand out of her pocket, and slapped her hand over his. Jackson's eyes widened, and he looked down as bodies slammed into the walls around him. It's metal, she whispered, smiling, then leaning forward, flecked with shards of pure silver. Jackson's breath caught and he fell back, sitting on the floor, looking up at her with eyes filled with anger and shock. She winked at him, ducked as someone was tossed into a wall, raining plaster down on her. Terrible shame. You are so adorable. Then she rubbed the flat stone over his exposed forearm. Oh, well, she shrugged with an evil smile. Then she half crawled down the hallway. Track hit the wall hard and cried out as something in his side cracked. He stood up and shook himself hard, putting a hand on his ribs. He went to lunge and then turned, seeing Jackson slumped against the wall. Jay, he yelled and moved over towards him. Don't touch me, the other croaked in a raspy voice. Silver. Track froze and then leaned a bit closer. The color of Jackson's skin was already pasty and his lips were losing their color. Ryan, Track yelled, and then grunted when someone tripped over him and landed on the ground inches away. He didn't recognize the form and yelled his alpha's name again, locking his eyes on his friend. Hang tight, Jay, he whispered. Jackson gave a small nod, leaning his head against the wall, his breathing choppy. Track was knocked to the ground then, and he fought the body off until he realized it was limp. He shoved it hard and scrambled to his feet, searching the wall. Jackson's eyes were closed, but his chest rose and fell fast. Too fast. Ryan! Track screamed, now turning to watch the chaos. Track went to grab his fallen friend and then pulled his hand back fast. The silver could come from his pores to the surface of his skin. There was another loud crack and the walls shook. Then Ryan pushed over and knelt next to Jackson. Don't touch him, Jackson shot out, and Ryan froze. He swallowed hard, covered in plaster and sweat. He knew the signs of silver poisoning. Do you have any antidote? The alpha yelled, turning to the others. Thomas was bent over a body and turned, then glanced at Jackson. He frowned and yanked his phone out of his pocket, his body still trying to calm the adrenaline. Michael and his two guards were still tackling three other men, but had pushed the battle to a safer distance. Get the silver antidote down here, now, he yelled into the phone, then rammed it back into his pants pocket. Jackson, Ryan barked, still winded by the fighting. Hold on, man, it's coming. Jackson's eyes fluttered open slowly and he licked his lips. Jeeps, he whispered in a weak voice. We'll find her. Track nodded, his throat tightening. Jackson gave a small nod and his eyes closed. Jay, Track yelled and lunged forward. Ryan shoved him back and shook his head. Rock knelt down, his eyes watering. Jay, man, come on, you can't go, he whispered. We've got plans, man. You and me, remember? Here's the doctor. They all turned as Dr. John ran towards them, a case swinging in his hand. He slid to a halt and dropped next to Jackson's limp body. Hurry up, Rock roared as the man flung open the case and started to pull things out. We have to find Raina, another voice stated, and they turned, looking up at Thomas. If Ellen is a part of this, then I know who's behind it. Phil stood, glancing again at his packmate as the doctor filled a syringe from a bottle. Oliver, the man stated, his jaw so tight it looked like it would snap. The guy that owns this place? Phil asked, looking down one more time and then turning back. Thomas nodded. Ellen, Miss Mullender, helped him a lot. She spent a lot of time here. He and I were business partners, and she handled my affairs here while I was away. He snarled and glared at the walls. He has a dark side that I have ignored until now. That would explain how they knew where to take her and why we can't find them, Ryan sighed, still kneeling on the rubble-covered floor. We have to go back to the pool and find the passage that leads under the go-kart track, Track stated. That's where they took her. There has to be another door there. Thomas nodded and Michael tapped his ear. They all looked back down at the doctor and Jackson, who wasn't moving. He pulled the needle out of the other's arms and sighed. I'll take care of him. You go find her. Ryan glanced at the white-coated man. Will he be okay? Dr. John grabbed another vial from his case, then another needle. I got here in time, he stated, and Rock let out a sigh of relief. He's going to be very weak and will need treatments for a while, he stated, but he'll live. Now go get her back. The wolves jumped up, determination hardening their faces. And inside that empty room, Raina paced the now empty room, glaring at the shiny walls. My arm throbbed and my jaw ached. The bed had been the only weapon I had. It had pulled apart easily enough. I smiled through tight eyes at the large dent in the metal door. Unfortunately, they had taken it away from me. I cursed myself for not thinking it through more. I should have done something different, found another way. But fear and rage were battling inside of me, and the silver was starting to make my head throb. Either that, or it was the after effect of trying to beat the huge vampire senseless when he came in to take the bed. So here I sat, in the middle of the naked room, on a blanket, the only thing they left me. The minutes slipped by, but my mind was too busy to notice. There was no way my wolf or pack could save me, not without endangering themselves. The walls were too thick for my dad and Michael to get through. It was up to me. I had to do something. Funny thing was, now I wasn't crying or shaking, and the fear was a far second to my determination to get out of here. When they had come through the door, I had seen the hallway. It was also stone, but I had noticed the ceiling with dim lights hanging from it. There was plaster, not stone. That had to be something. If the ceiling was the only weakness, it was still a weakness. Then I felt my legs start to tingle. I gasped, but then it pulsed and left. I guess the silver was preventing that too. I frowned and closed my eyes, concentrating and finding that place deep inside of me that held the core of my wolf's side. I remembered the sensation and tried to force it. It responded, but then retreated. Come on, I hissed through clenched teeth. We have to fight. My body shook as it fought to shift, sitting in a room lined in silver. If nothing else, it pushed the fear deeper inside. I struggled until I felt trickles of moisture run down the side of my face. Finally, I let out a hard breath and opened my eyes. Nothing. A thought hit me then, and I closed my eyes again. I forced myself to calm down and thought about Phil. I pictured his face, recalling every line, every shadow, every fleck of color in his beautiful brown eyes. I locked onto his eyes and concentrated, then whispered his name, letting something rumble through me as I did. My legs tingled and I smiled, calling my wolf a little louder, pulling all my strength, letting my fear and anger build inside of me. My legs tingled again. Our little blue house, I thought. 2 ovens, a huge bathroom, another tingle. I inhaled and remembered his scent, sweet and musky. My head tilted as I recalled his touch against my cheek. I love you, I whispered as the tingle started to grow. Several minutes later, I heard the panel slide open and the doctor called my name. I felt my lip twitch, but stayed still. The door opened and I listened to the creaking to determine just the right time. Then I leapt out from under the blanket and attacked. Back with the pack, Thomas and Michael, along with a dozen other guards, scoured the pool room. They had met with another dozen of Oliver's men, and all but one laid, unmoving now, on the trampled paradise. Michael held the other man's hand behind his back. "Show me where she is," he hissed into the man's ear. The other vampire remained quiet, and Michael growled lowly. "We will find it without you, then," he stated, moving his hands up to the man's neck. "Even if you do, you won't find the other door," the man gasped quickly. Thomas turned, hearing it, and stepped up in front of him. "You know where they're keeping her?" When Oliver's man nodded, Thomas reached into his pocket and held out a key. "There's a car in the garage. Give us the information, and I swear no one will stop you." He saw the other one think through the offer, and Thomas nodded. "Oliver will not be around to seek you out. It's over there." Thomas called the others over, and they moved towards a bench near the waterfall. Underneath, there's a latch." The man winced as Michael pulled his arms harder behind him. Martin knelt down and felt under the stone bench, then smiled, and they all heard a click. "Whoa," Rock gasped, as a tree literally slid a few feet to one side. Thomas walked over and smiled down at the hole, with stairs disappearing into the darkness. "He says there's another door." "I'm not telling you that until I'm sitting in that car," the man stated, trying to sound stronger than he felt. They could all smell the fear racing through Oliver's paid muscle. "You'll tell us now," Thomas hissed, coming almost nose to nose with the other man. "A right and two lefts, then look for the sun," he stated as if reciting something. Then he yelped as Michael nearly dislocated his arm as he pulled it back harder. "That's how you get there," the man gasped. "Get where?" Track growled as they surrounded him. Then something flickered in the guard's eyes and Thomas's nose twitched. "He doesn't know." Michael started to pull the man towards the far end of the room. "But that's how to get there. We've been told. Only a few of us. That's how you get there." A minute later, Michael came back, alone. "A right, two lefts, and look for the sun," Thomas repeated, looking down into the hole. Phil shrugged. At least the riddles in English could have been worse. With that, he descended through the hidden opening. The others followed. There were no lights here, no workers, no tools stacked up. Their eyes took a minute to adjust, and they looked around. The passage was narrow, only 2 people wide, and the ceiling was only inches above Michael's head. When they came to the first fork, they turned right. Phil started to jog forward, focusing on the pull inside of him. A minute later, he turned left and picked up speed. He ran 100 yards and frowned when any fork only had a right turn option. He kept straight ahead and was ready to shred something when the next cross-section had a left. "Okay, now look for a sun," he yelled over his shoulder, his eyes scanning in the darkness. The walls were thicker here, cement on both sides as well as under them. Track inhaled and smiled. She was here. The tight hall was filled with the sounds of everyone inhaling, and then heads bobbed in agreement. "What the?" Rock gasped, causing everyone to turn. There was a mural, painted on an otherwise dull wall. It was a painted scene of a beach. There were people sitting in lounge chairs, standing around laughing, and there was a sun in the sky. The round object actually gave off a very soft glow. Sun walking, Thomas stated, standing in front of the odd painting. He reached out towards the round object and then winced, pulling his hand back quickly, looking at it. UV rays, he stated, seeing the reddened skin. Ryan nodded and put his hand out towards the painting. Wait, Rock gasped, grabbing his alpha's wrist. Look! Ryan leaned forward and noticed the oddly glowing circle and the sparkling flecks inside it. Great, Track snapped. We have a button right in front of us and none of us can touch it. He balled up his fists and then started to yank his shirt over his head. He wrapped it around his hand. I can do that for you. They all whirled around and froze. A female stood there, looking almost shy. Michael snatched her arm and held her, though her slender frame and meek eyes instantly made him relax his grip. Her soft brown hair was wavy and disappeared over her back. She looked through the crowd and smiled at Phil. He blinked and then frowned. Who are you? She stepped out of Michael's grip and the bodyguard blinked in shock. She seemed to almost glide as she walked up to Phil. My name is Andrala, but you can call me Andy. He looked at her for a long minute and she nodded, then reached up and pushed the sun. There was a loud click and Track turned and pushed a hidden door open. Who are you? Phil asked again, for some reason unable to take his eyes off the meek female in front of him. She blushed softly and smiled. Someone who has been given permission to help. Andy stood there quietly while others stared at her. Finally, Track shook his head. Come on, we have to find... With that, something lunged through the door and plowed through them before skidding to a halt and slamming into Michael's legs. Ray! Track yelled, rushing over and kneeling next to the black wolf. Don't touch me, she thought, and he pulled his hands back, then frowned, seeing flecks of metal on the tips of the fur near her front legs. Silver, he shouted, and Michael reached down, shoving his arms under the wolf. He lifted her, and they all ran back towards the stairs. When they reached the pool room, they saw 2 more guards rushing towards them. Michael ran forward, keeping the wolf in his arms. Then he turned and swung his leg, dropping one, his foot slamming downwards, and then he kept going. The other one didn't follow. He's in the lab, Thomas yelled, with his phone to his ear. Michael nodded, turned, and ran faster. Now Rena talks. I bounced wildly in my bodyguard's arms, and I smiled inside. They had found me. I closed my eyes and gave in to the taint that moved through me. There wasn't much, but it was working through my system, and I was so tired. It had taken everything I had to fight through the others and make my way down that passage. The door had opened just when I thought I couldn't make my legs move. I heard another voice and opened my eyes. Phil smiled at me as he ran next to us. When we entered the lab, I looked up and saw Dr. John turn. Then I saw Jackson on a stretcher, and I let out a whimper. He's okay, Phil stated, shoving things off another narrow white bed. I heard my dad shouting orders behind me, but I yawned, wanting to sleep. A syringe appeared in front of me, and I blinked slowly as I felt it pierce my hide. Then I sneezed, and then sneezed again. The doctor frowned, and my head bobbed as I sneezed several more times. I batted at my nose with my half-limp paw and growled with irritation. Another sneeze, and my dad stepped up. Why is she doing that? He hissed. Because she can smell me, came a soft voice. I lifted my head and looked through the guys. My head tilted when I saw the strange but petite female standing next to Rock. He had a grip on her upper arm, but held her gently. She smiled at me, and I sneezed again, which made her giggle. Something about her seemed so young, but her eyes told another story. They were filled with wisdom. "May I?" she asked, looking at Phil. He shook his head and I sneezed again. "You're a witch," my dad gasped, and I frowned and looked at him and then back at her. "My name is Andy," she said, smiling back at me, "and your father is correct." Rock quickly let go of his captive and took a step back, his eyes wide. Phil stood next to my head as the doctor started to wash my fur with a strange-smelling solution. "She is the only one that can sense me," she stated, in a matter-of-fact but somehow sweet voice. Rock leaned forward and inhaled, his eyes shooting wide open. "I can't smell anything." "What do you mean you can't smell?" Track hissed, walking up and inhaling inches from her head. "What the?" he gasped, shook his head hard, and inhaled again deeply. "Nothing," he whispered in awe and confusion. "It's like she isn't even here." The doctor turned and smiled. "Amazing." "How do you do that?" Ryan asked, also inhaling and finding the wolves were correct. "We have to get out of here," Thomas stated. "The cars are standing by and the plane is nearly ready." "Cal," Jackson stated in a low voice. The doctor nodded. He can travel in a wheelchair. Martin left at a run, and I sat, legs tucked under me, and stared at the nearly fragile-looking girl while the doctor worked on me. I sneezed a few more times, but with several minutes in between. It's like I was getting used to her odd smell. "What does she smell like?" Phil whispered, sitting on a stool next to my head. "I don't know," I thought, turning to look at him. "It's not really a scent. It just tickles my nose or tickles inside of me," and I shook my head to show I couldn't explain it any more than that. There really was no scent. Then I looked at him. "She's been here for a while." His eyes widened and he turned. "This isn't the first time she's had this reaction. Are there more of you here?" He stuttered a bit. "Not here," she smiled. "I've been watching her for a long time." My dad's phone went off, and it took him a second to react. When he put the phone to his ear, the awe dropped from his eyes, and he turned to the doctor. "Get your stuff together. We're leaving." The doctor gasped. "But I have to clean her." He looked around his lab. "I will need to get—" Michael stepped up. "I'll finish with her. You get what you need." "Hold her," my dad said, looking at Rock, who swallowed hard. "It's all right. I have been instructed to stay with you now," she smiled. "No disrespect," my dad said, his voice shaking a bit. I watched as she nodded, stepped up to Rock, and took his hand gently. His eyes blinked hard, and she turned her smile on me. I sneezed again, and she giggled. Track and Ryan ran over and grabbed things as the doctor pointed to them. He pulled out 2 large plastic crates and started to fill them. "Be careful with that," he roared as Ryan dumped some bottles into one. I was starting to feel stronger and stood so that Michael could get the solution under me and on my legs. The weakness made my legs shake a bit, but I was in much better shape than Jackson. I whimpered towards him, and one of his arms lifted, and I smiled as he gave me a thumbs up. When Michael was done, he stood back and let me give myself a hard shake. Phil grabbed a towel and went to dry me off. "No!" the doctor yelled. "It's not safe yet." I saw Phil frown, and I gave him a supportive bark. "It's okay," I thought, and he growled, handing Michael the towel. "We have to go now," my dad stated. "There are more coming." That perked my eyes and ears up, and I jumped off the table, my legs buckling under me. Michael snatched me up into his arms. Martin showed up with Cal sitting in a wheelchair, and I barked at him. He smiled and waved. It was the first time I had seen him since the attack on the road. Both of his legs were in cast and propped out in front of him. There was a sling over one of his arms, and his body was surrounded by pillows. I yelped. He really was in bad shape. Track shoved the crates under Jackson's gurney, and we headed out of the room. The halls were eerily quiet and empty, our footsteps echoing as we went. We made it to the garage without incident, and I was loaded into an SUV. They laid Jackson on the seat while I took the floor. Phil went to climb in, and Michael shook his head. I'm going with her, he stated and jumped in, but made sure he didn't touch me. Track followed, and Michael glared. It's okay, my dad stated, chuckling a bit. I don't think there's a force in the universe that could keep them away from her right now. Then he turned and pointed to the girl. I want her in the same car, up front, with me. Rock and Andy climbed in. Rock was in the driver's seat and the tiny girl in the middle. Michael climbed in the back and crammed his massive form on the seat with Phil and Track. They'll be waiting for us when we leave, Phil said, leaning over the front seat. Rock nodded. Then buckle up, 'cause I am done with this game, he hissed, and shifted the car into drive. And that's where I'm going to stop.